Hey everyone, I'm Joe. Welcome back to Sip and Talk. Okay, so last time we started looking at this really complex topic, China's dual role in global narratives.
Right, sometimes presented as a victim, sometimes seen as an aggressor. It can feel contradictory.
Exactly. And it really begs the question, why? Why does China often frame things this way?
What are the justifications, the sort of perceived righteousness behind actions that, let's face it, look very different from the outside?
That's what this deep dive is all about. We're going back into the analysis you provided, trying to understand the Chinese perspective, the reasoning, the logic, as laid out in these sources.
Yeah, and it's really important to stress our goal here is just to explore these justifications and the contradictions the analysis itself points out.
Strictly based on the source material.
And we're not, weighing in on whether these claims are valid. We're just trying to understand the viewpoint being presented in the analysis.
Got it. And I'm genuinely curious to see how this analysis unpacks that why.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, from an external view, some actions and the stated reasons, they can be hard to square. So let's jump in. The sources talk about how China might justify things often criticized internationally, like its approach to technology acquisition, maybe methods seen as IP theft or espionage.
Okay, so the analysis suggests China might frame acquiring technology and knowledge as, well, a necessary step for a developing nation trying to catch up.
Like a shortcut.
Kind of. It points to historical arguments presented in the sources, the idea that, Western nations also used various means, maybe including forms of industrial espionage, back when they were developing.
So framing it as almost a historical norm for development, like this is just how countries get ahead.
That seems to be one dimension presented, yeah. The sources also suggest China might frame it as defense against what it calls tech bullying.
Tech bullying.
Yeah. The analysis mentions things like U.S. export controls, those restrictions on semiconductors. From this perspective, those are seen as direct attempts to block China's legitimate economic and technological rise.
Right, okay. So actions like aggressively pursuing tech, even maybe through, let's say, unconventional means, could be justified internally as necessary to protect their own development against what they see as Western efforts to keep them down.
Exactly, as the analysis lays it out. And this ties into a kind of broader sense of justification they apparently feel.
How so?
The sources say China sees itself as acting justly because it believes the global economic and tech order has historically been stacked against developing nations, dominated by the West, with rules seen as inherently unfair.
And this connects back to that idea we hear a lot about national rejuvenation.
Yes, absolutely. The analysis really highlights how official narratives described in the sources stress that these efforts acquiring tech, building industry, are all aimed at improving living standards and achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
Framing it as a necessary historical mission, almost, to overcome past humiliations and perceived injustices.
That's the idea presented. And, on the flip side, the sources also note China might just flat out deny accusations of systematic IP theft.
Just deny it.
Yeah, framing those accusations as, exaggerated smears by the West, designed to hinder China's rise and maybe mask the West's own hegemonic aims.
Okay, so shifting the narrative, pointing the finger back at the accuser. Got it. Let's pivot a bit. Another big area the sources explore, the justification for China's military stance on Taiwan, including, crucially, not ruling out force. How does the analysis explain that justification?
Well, the core justification, according to the analysis, is China's fundamental position that Taiwan is an inseparable part of its territory, full stop.
Based on
historical, cultural, and legal arguments presented in the sources. They often reference the UN's recognition of the One China principle.
Okay.
So from China's perspective, as analyzed here, policies coming from the DPP in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, that promote Taiwan independence, those are seen as a direct threat, a challenge to this core interest, and the basis for any stability across the strait.
So the analysis suggests the independence movement itself is framed as the main provocation.
That's a key point highlighted in the analysis, yes. Military actions, like those flights into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADI.
Right, that monitoring zone, not sovereign airspace technically, but still provocative.
Exactly. Those flights, or naval exercises, they're presented in the sources as necessary deterrence. Deterrence against these perceived separatist forces.
The goal being?
The stated goal, from this perspective, is to stop Taiwan moving towards permanent independence and to, protect national sovereignty and unity.
And the sources also mention something about dwindling hopes for peaceful unification.
Yes, the analysis suggests China might argue that not ruling out force is becoming, in their view, a necessary last resort because they see peaceful options fading.
And who do they blame for that, according to the analysis?
It's blamed on what they perceive as the DPP's provocations, and also, significantly, what the sources describe as U.S. interference, things like arms sales to Taiwan or diplomatic support.
Wow, okay, so the justification essentially points fingers outwards for the potential need for military action. Where does the idea of justice come into this, according to the analysis?
The analysis suggests China sees pursuing unification as inherently just because it's viewed as absolutely central to that national rejuvenation goal we mentioned.
Right.
The Taiwan issue is framed strictly as an internal affair. External interference, from this viewpoint, has zero legitimacy. The sources highlight arguments that Western countries, especially the U.S., are just using Taiwan strategically, like a pawn to contain China.
Therefore, the military pressure
is framed as defensive, necessary to protect national security, territorial integrity, aligning with what they see as any sovereign state's right. The analysis even notes they might claim people in Taiwan are somehow misled by the DPP, and China's actions, despite the pressure, are ultimately for the long-term good of everyone involved.
That is a very different way of looking at it. Okay, beyond specific actions like tech or Taiwan, the sources also look at China's broader communication strategy, sometimes including negative portrayals of others. Wow. Why do that, based on the analysis?
Well, the sources suggest China might see negative portrayals, say, of the U.S. or the DPP as a necessary counter-narrative, a defense against what it views as constant Western anti-China propaganda.
So fighting fire with fire in the information space.
Essentially, yeah. That's how the analysis presents it. Official media, as described in the sources, are used to highlight what China frames as U.S. hegemonic behavior.
What does it mean in this context, hegemonic behavior?
According to the sources, it refers to things like U.S. military deployments in the region, economic sanctions, perceived double standards on human rights, all framed as direct threats to China's sovereignty and development. Actions seen as trying to assert dominance. And criticism of the DPP, the sources say, is aimed at highlighting its perceived independence agenda, reminding people in Taiwan and internationally of the supposed danger its policies pose to peace.
So this narrative strategy serves multiple purposes.
The analysis notes a dual purpose, yes. One, consolidating domestic support, boosting nationalism, which can be useful when facing internal pressures, maybe economic ones. And two, competing internationally for discourse power, trying to shape a more positive global image for China.
And how is that framed as just?
The sources indicate China sees itself as just in this because it believes it's the victim of global hegemonism.
Victim?
Yeah. The U.S. is portrayed as the aggressive power trying to contain China's rise. The DPP is framed as separatist forces, colluding with external powers, essentially betraying the Chinese nation.
So they position themselves as defenders.
Exactly. China might emphasize, according to the analysis, that its actions patrols in the South China Sea, economic measures, whatever, are just responses to provocation, aimed at defending peace, stability, a fair international order, contrasting this with what they paint as the West's destabilizing actions.
It's a powerful narrative, framing yourself as the righteous defender against threats and unfairness. The sources really try to get at why this sense of justification is so, deeply rooted, right? What are the underlying drivers the analysis points to?
Yes, the analysis identifies several core drivers. First and foremost is history and nationalism.
The century of humiliation.
Precisely. That memory, mid-19th to early 20th century, foreign aggression, unequal treaties, it's left a really deep scar. It fuels a powerful sense of nationalism. China's current rise is often viewed internally as correcting those historical wrongs.
So actions we've discussed are framed as restoring dignity and sovereignty.
Necessary steps, yeah. Especially the Taiwan issue unification is seen as absolutely crucial to finally overcoming that historical shame, according to this perspective.
The weight of that history, as presented in the sources, sounds immense. What else is key?
Geopolitics and security concerns are huge. China genuinely perceives itself, the analysis suggests, as facing encirclement by the U.S. and its allies.
What points to that from their perspective?
The analysis mentions the U.S. military presence in the Asia-Pacific, alliances like AHCR, the Quad, arms sales to Taiwan, involvement in South China Sea disputes. These are all seen as direct threats to China's security.
So from China's viewpoint, this geopolitical pressure makes its responses seem legitimate.
It makes things like military maneuvers, economic retaliation, even aggressive tech acquisitions seem like necessary defense of national interests. Just like any sovereign state would defend itself, is the argument presented.
And this is where that idea the sources mentioned comes in threats coming to our doorstep.
Exactly. The analysis explains how China frames things like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They emphasize NATO expansion, U.S. provocation as forcing Russia's hand.
And they apply that logic elsewhere.
The sources suggest they apply that narrative directly to the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. They see the DPP's stance, or U.S. and allied actions there, as threats coming to their doorstep, which in turn justifies their own military exercises and patrols as purely defensive responses.
So it's a lens for viewing others' actions, but also a justification for their own actions.
Precisely. It's part of the framework presented in the sources. Another big factor is domestic stability and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party.
How does that play in?
Well, the party's legitimacy rests partly on delivering economic growth and, importantly, appealing to nationalism. By portraying external entities, the U.S., the DPP, as adversaries, the analysis suggests China can sometimes deflect attention from domestic problems.
Like economic slowdowns or social issues?
Potentially, yes. And it reinforces that self-perception of being the just side, defending the nation and its people, which is presented as the absolute top priority.
Makes sense for internal cohesion. What about cultural factors the sources bring up?
The sources note that while China talks about peaceful development and win-win cooperation, it also strongly believes that Western models of democracy and human rights just aren't suitable for China's unique conditions.
So defending their own path.
Exactly. From this viewpoint, China's actions, even if they look aggressive outside, are framed internally as defending its own development path and cultural identity against what it might call Western ideological hegemony, trying to impose values.
Okay, so based on this analysis, we've really dug into the justifications, the deeper historical, geopolitical, domestic, cultural reasons why China might see itself as acting justly. But the sources also point out some pretty significant contradictions within all this, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is where the analysis really highlights the tensions. The first major contradiction noted is the gap between China constantly presenting itself as a victim, condemning U.S. containment or DPP provocation,
right,
and its own actions, which often look coercive or destabilizing to others. The sources specifically mention things like militarizing those artificial islands in the South China Sea or the sustained intense military pressure on Taiwan. These actions clearly clash with that victim narrative.
Yeah, the peaceful defender story seems pretty hard to reconcile with some of those actions. What about economics? Many contradictions there.
The sources point to one between China's stated support for free trade and globalization and its actual use of things like retaliatory tariffs or export controls against specific countries. The U.S., Australia were examples given.
So selective application.
That's how the analysis views it, based on the sources. It undermines their public stance on open markets and looks a lot like economic coercion, not legitimate defense to many observers.
And Taiwan, you mentioned earlier the claim of wanting peaceful unification alongside military threats.
That's a really key contradiction the sources hammer home. The analysis sees huge tension between advocating peaceful unification under one country, two systems, while simultaneously ramping up military pressure significantly.
And the sources gave specifics on that pressure.
They did. The analysis pointed to data like over 2,200 aerial intrusions into Taiwan's ADI in just the first few months of 2025 alone. That alongside cyber attacks.
Wow, 2,200 in a few months.
Yeah. That scale of military activity, the analysis notes, makes it incredibly difficult for the outside world to buy the peaceful intentions narrative. It seems to directly contradict the stated goal of acting for the well-being of people on both sides of the strait.
That number really does highlight the disconnect the analysis identifies. Any other crucial contradictions the sources flagged?
Yes. Another one noted is between China's frequent denials of systematic IP theft or state-sponsored hacking, often dismissing it all as Western smears,
right,
and the existence of pretty concrete cases detailed elsewhere, like in U.S. Justice Department indictments or reports from cybersecurity firms. That discrepancy, according to the analysis, really damages China's claim to be acting justly or even truthfully.
And that coming to our doorstep idea, the sources found a contradiction there too.
They did. The analysis points out what it calls hypocrisy, supporting Russia's doorstep argument regarding Ukraine, while China itself routinely sends military planes and ships into Taiwan's ADZ or into the exclusive economic zones of its South China Sea neighbors, sometimes even harassing their ships.
A double standard.
Highlighted as a double standard and selective logic, yes. And similarly, the sources contrast China criticizing NATO and the U.S. for threatening Russia, while China itself conducts massive military drills near Taiwan and Southeast Asian nations' actions those countries definitely see as threatening their security.
It really sounds like the analysis presented in these sources consistently finds this gap, a gap between China's stated intentions or justifications and its actual behavior, which ultimately hurts the credibility of its narrative internationally.
That's the core tension identified, absolutely. From the perspective laid out on the analysis, China's actions are framed internally as necessary. Necessary to protect sovereignty, secure development, fulfill this historical mission, mostly responding to perceived external threats.
And that sense of justice is deep-rooted.
Deeply rooted, the analysis suggests, in things like the century of humiliation, real geopolitical security fears, domestic political needs, and cultural identity. But, as the sources detail, the significant contradictions between those justifications and the actions themselves, particularly the more aggressive moves in the South China Sea, the intense military pressure on Taiwan, the use of economic coercion, these severely undermine how persuasive that narrative is outside of China.
So it's the complex balancing act.
Exactly. The analysis concludes it often looks very contradictory externally, as China tries to juggle its internal priorities while asserting itself on the world stage.
Okay. So we've really gone deep into the analysis provided today. We've looked at how China justifies its actions and narrative, the deeper reasons driving that sense of righteousness, and also the significant contradictions the sources highlight.
We've seen how powerful factors like historical memory, perceived security threats, domestic politics, cultural identity, how they all shape this specific perspective.
And understanding this viewpoint, even when the actions or the justifications might seem controversial or contradictory to us on the outside, it's still crucial for you, the listener, as you try to make sense of complex international relations and all the information flying around.
It really shows how different histories, different security concerns can lead to fundamentally different interpretations of the very same events, especially when actions seem to clash so strongly with stated intentions.
Absolutely. It underscores the huge challenge in finding common ground when basic perceptions of history, security, even what counts as defense versus aggression differ so much. Which kind of leaves us with this thought, building on the sources. How often do national narratives, especially ones built on past victimhood or perceived need for defense, end up shaping current actions? And if it's so hard for different sides to see past their own histories and fears, particularly when actions contradict words, what does this analysis really tell us about the practical hurdles to finding ways forward in international relations?
Yeah, something definitely worth pondering.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. And hey, if you enjoy digging into these topics, please do subscribe to the deep dive. We'd appreciate it.
Until next time.